The Roman Empire had always been a point of attraction for the different peoples who lived at the margins. Closeness to the empire meant, in fact, sharing a part of the wealth of this unique and powerful superstructure, which emerged from the city of Rome. By trade, warfare, robbery, enrollment into the Roman army, or diplomatic deals, the barbarian elites managed to profit from the superior economic structures of their powerful neighbors. In the 4th century, we can observe an increasing trend among barbarian tribes to get an even greater share by becoming a genuine part of this empire. Thus, groups of neighboring tribes tried to receive land inside the empire, and to obtain, thus, the protection of the Pax Romana, especially in troubled times. This partly aggressive barbarian invasions challenged the leading groups of the Roman Empire, and first of all the emperors themselves, to cope with a new situation. While the Roman Empire witnessed for centuries imperialistic extension till the end of the 2nd century AD, new tribal coalitions like the Alemanni or the Goths endangered the given structures of the empire. For a reassessment of relations between barbarians and the Roman Empire, we have to ask first of all one crucial question that in the past was always answered affirmatively. Was the Roman Empire doomed since the 3rd century AD? The problem with this crucial question is virtually the same as with nearly all questions of the kind. There are still no definite answers, but with our approach, we want at least to try to raise awareness of some of the intriguing issues of late antiquity that can help to reassess imperial politics from the 3rd and 4th century in a context of rational and well-reflected foreign policies. We cannot deal with all aspects of this complex matter in this short introduction, so we will focus only on 3 aspects. First, recent archaeological evidence from central Germany suggests that the whole so-called Germanic world was in turmoil after the Marcomannic Wars, and that Roman foreign policy saw a realignment of allies by preferring new partners. This massive change in politics, which led to completely new arrangements, was probably the starting point for a complete reshuffle of the political order in the hinterland of the Limes, where new groups of Germanic warriors coagulated and thus gave birth to those major groups, which began to attack the Roman Empire with much more success during the 3rd century. This will be presented in detail by Hans Ulrich Voss in this volume, who has studied these aspects, which until now were largely unappreciated in the region between the rivers Elbe and Oder in Germany. Secondly, we would like to outline the Roman Empire's new diplomatic and strategic approaches, which became manifest especially from the beginning of the 4th century, to highlight the very flexible reactions of the Roman leadership towards the new threats of better organized barbarians, who had improved their skills above all as vital parts of the Roman defensive strategy, allies or mercenaries of the Romans one day, and enemies and raiders the next. We chose the example of the Alemannic leader Macrianus and his relationship with Rome. The aspects of new defense strategies as visible along the Danube in the so-called Innenbefestigungen, or inner fortifications, will be treated in a paper in this volume, so that we can pass over this aspect at this stage. Finally, we would also like to touch briefly on the question of whether Edward Luttwak, with his idea of an explicit imperial strategy, should not be given more credit today than 40 years ago, when we did not know so much about Roman efforts to organize large campaigns even in late antiquity, and our knowledge of Roman diplomacy was very limited. The so-called Hartshorn event, or skirmish, is a prime example for the evidence of archaeological sources in such considerations. The site is on a hilltop spur and confirms the presence of a Roman army to the east of the river Weser in the first half of the 3rd century, probably in AD 235 under the Emperor Maximinus Thrax. It is hardly conceivable that a Roman army could have operated so deep inside Germania without secure supply lines and local allies. At about the same time or a little later in central Germany, in the present-day federal states of Thuringia and Saxony-Anhalt, princely graves of the so-called Hasleben-Leune group, richly equipped with Roman goods, start to appear. The systematic recording of the entire spectrum of Roman artifacts in Germanic contexts and a consideration of the 1st and 2nd century AD gives us a clue as to why Rome turned its attention to this region. The funerary customs of native elites from the Atlantic to the Caucasus, with characteristic sets of metal vessels, reveals a degree of standardization in Roman influence that was deliberately used to win allies during the first 2 centuries AD. On the other hand, other combinations, for example, the use of bronze buckets as funerary urns, covered with bronze bowls as lids, in combination with other grave goods, are evidence for Germanic elite networks that formed the basis of communication and exchange in the period up to the end of the Marcomannic Wars. The range of Roman finds allows us not only to recognize Roman impact with its chronological and chronological differences, but also helps understand the cultural individualities of different groups, whether among or between the Germans, Balts, and Sarmatians. It becomes more and more apparent that the so-called barbarians are not only objects of Roman action, but also active parts in the arrangement of relations with the empire. The elite networks that we are able to identify in the early and late imperial periods reveal a tendency that at a general level can be understood as the development of a growing self-confidence on the part of Germanic groups, and even emancipation from the Roman Empire. Rome responded with a strategy succinctly described by Tacitus, Germania 33:2. May the nations retain and perpetuate, if not an affection for us, at least an animosity against each other. Since, while the fate of the empire is thus urgent, fortune can bestow no higher benefit upon us than the discord of our enemies. Maneat queso. Duretque gentibus, si non amor nostri ad certe odium sui, quando urgentibus imperii fatis nihil, iam praese fortuna maius potest hostium discordiam. As the archaeological record suggests, Rome used its influence subtly to fulfill this wish. Therefore, after the Marcomannic Wars during the crisis of the 3rd century too, it was particularly important for Rome to have strategic allies in central Germany and the Thuringian Basin, in the rear of Rome's immediate neighbors on the Rhine border, in order to provide a defense against Germanic invaders. The direct and indirect control of the territories immediately outside the imperial border was of vital interest to the Romans. The Romans had a whole range of possibilities, from intelligence and intelligence gathering to massive military intervention. The most important and effective, and at the same time, the most favorable method of exerting influence in the border areas of the Barbaricum, however, was advanced client management, as Heather calls the differentiated shaping of relations with the tribes and kingdoms on the northern edge of the empire. Even in the 4th century, the foreign policy of the Roman Empire oscillated between clever diplomacy, alliance politics, and military pressure. In late antiquity, however, the treatment of the clientele border states and their leaders increasingly changed to a variety of possible instruments of influence in the Barbaricum, while in the early imperial era, military intervention and the use or toleration of client kings dominated. The extension of the options for action can be explained most impressively by means of an example. After 350, the empire had to concentrate on the conflict with the Persians and to deal with the usurper Magnentius in Gaul, and thus left the local chieftains on the Rhine border in peace for a time. In this context, local lords with their federations could penetrate the limes. Julian, who had been appointed as Caesar in Gaul, took successful action against the Alemanni near Strasbourg, but then had to turn to other locations in his conflict with Constantius II. As Augustus, he had to devote himself from 361 on to imperial affairs. When from 365 I had to keep order on the Rhine, the minor king Macrianus, leader of the tribe of the Buccinobants, was soon a thorn in his side, although he had previously been in agreement with Julian. The problem with the client kings tolerated by Rome was, of course, always that such normally useful allies often became a danger when they became too powerful, precisely because of their increased prestige through their contacts with Rome. On the subject of client kings, see especially the fundamental work of Kornemann, 1934, further Kina, 2001, and Baltrush, Winkler, 2015, when imperial forces had to be concentrated in other parts of the empire. Some of the unstable Roman allies were easily tempted to invade poorly protected border areas. This was apparently also the case with the troublemaker Macrianus, who soon became a priority for Valentinian Nero. Macrianus could only achieve his outstanding position within his peer group and his mini-empire through his former alliance with the Romans, which underlines the potential danger of such arrangements for the Roman side. Valentian's first attempt to eliminate the unloved leader of the Bucinobantes in 369-370 was the most effective and economical method imaginable. He exploited the Discordia Hostium to take action against Macrianus in an alliance with the Burgundians, who at that time were settled further east and were enemies of the Alemanni. It had apparently been Valentinian's plan from the very beginning to let the Burgundians and the Bucinobants fight each other in order not to have to engage his own resources in this proxy war. However, the Burgundians refused to take action against Macrianus alone, when they realized that the Romans themselves were unwilling to take part in the fighting and left angrily with their great army. When this attempt failed, 1 year later, Valentinian tried to kidnap his unpleasant opponent with a targeted commando mission. When he heard of Macrianus's presence in his residence near today Wiesbaden, apparently Macrianus could move freely and relaxed in the border area. He sent a detachment across the Rhine, which, however, made too much noise and thus warned the enemy, who could quickly raise the alarm with their leader and bring him to safety at the last minute. Immediately afterwards, the Romans used another means. They appointed a certain Fraio Marius as king of the Bushinobante in order to depose Macrianus, who was still evading Roman intervention. However, Fraio Marius could not prevail against the troublemaker, who may have been much detested by the Romans, but was all the more popular among his own people. Fraio Marius probably had to submit to his predecessor in 372 or 373, and was subsequently sent to Britain by his employers as commander of an Alemannic auxiliary force. When Valentinian had to prepare a campaign against the Quades in 374, he decided to offer peace to his opponent on the right bank of the Rhine in order to ensure security on this front. Macrianus celebrated his meeting with the emperor and savored his increased prestige to the full. He appeared at the meeting point near Mainz on the right bank of the Rhine with a truly royal attitude. Bursting with pride, he presented himself as the actual peacemaker. While the emperor was negotiating on the Rhine from a ship, Macrianus had probably stayed on his own bank of the Rhine for security reasons and discussed the conditions with the emperor from equal to equal with his head proudly raised, not without also pulling off a show by letting his men beat their shields wildly. The agreement arrived at by mutual accord probably provided guarantees for his possessions on the right bank of the Rhine in return for loyalty to the alliance. Interestingly, from then until his death in an ambush in the land of the Franks, which he had probably invaded on a Roman mission, Macrianus turned out to be a loyal ally who caused no more problems. A useful modern account on these events is Drinkwater. With the course of events on the Rhine in this short period, the various means by which the Romans were able to shape their foreign policy on the imperial borders can be seen as examples. The proxy war using the motto, divide et impera, the promotion of intra-Germanic conflicts and the targeted use of certain allies in a resource-saving fight against identified enemies is the most efficient form of client management, rarely described in the sources, but already masterfully implemented by Julius Caesar. There are some indications that the archaeological traces of massive conflicts inside Germania from the 3rd century onwards could have been the results of such a policy. Abduction or murder of undesirable enemy leaders. Late antiquity in particular is characterized by this form of elimination of potential and current dangers posed by barbarian neighbors. The model for Valentinian had undoubtedly been Julian, who kidnapped the Alemannic warlord Gaukönig Vademari when he unsuspectingly accepted an invitation to a feast with the Caesar. Another dangerous feast was prepared in 377 for the leaders of the Goths Fritigern and Alavivus, who had reached Scythia Minor crossing the Danube with many compatriots and caused their host Lupicinus permanent problems. The half-heartedly attempted assassination, to which only the bodyguards fell victim, sparked off an uprising among the Gothic refugees, which after the defeat of Hadrianopolis and the settlement of the Goths under their own right, was to have enormous consequences for the inner constitution of the empire. Keyword, foederati. Another famous example is the attempted assassination of the Hunnic leader Attila by a treacherous relative, which was thwarted to the great misfortune for the empire. Lee has collected a large number of other examples. This quite perfidious method, which was often used under blatant abuse of the rights of guests, likewise brings the advantage of maximum efficiency, since usually the barbarians had no institutions or established royal dynasties, and thus just gathered around influential leaders. With the surgical elimination of such a leader, the problem was usually solved immediately for a long time. The establishment of a client or puppet king by Rome's grace, replacing insubordinate rulers on the periphery with a pretender by the grace of Rome, had been a tried and tested means of foreign policy since Republican times. This works either directly, as in the not entirely happy case of Fraio Marius, or indirectly by supporting a usurper or a dissatisfied vice-relative of the leader who was to be replaced. The classic bilateral peace treaty, with or without provisions for an alliance. Contractual agreements entail obligations for both sides and always mean a compromise, but offer the advantage of maximum conservation of resources, which was often the order of the day, especially in times of comprehensive military engagement on several fronts. There were significant shifts from the 5th century in particular, as the subsidy payments, which previously had been a form of stimulus for former opponents and current allies, also important for the 6th century, prestige of the leaders most benefiting from the payments, or almost funds for reconstruction or development aid, increasingly, especially since Attila, became a form of blackmail to maintain the status quo. Contrary to the often circulated image of subsidies as morally questionable bribes or protection money, payments and gifts to barbarian princes were of outstanding importance for both sides. On the one hand, they guaranteed the Romans a buffer zone protected by friendly kings, basically acting in Rome's interest. On the other hand, the Germanic leaders were dependent on the gifts because they could only maintain their position of power by redistributing to their followers the wealth that was guaranteed from outside. In principle, subsidies and gifts thus belonged to the classic arsenal of diplomatic influence and were essentially centered on 3 political objectives: payment for alliances against a more powerful enemy, the buying of peace, standstill agreement, and also discord between the neighboring barbarian groups, inciting them to warlike conflicts against each other. Many items labeled as Roman imports probably had been such diplomatic gifts or stimuli. This is just a small detail of a much larger picture, but it should give us some hints for a possible reassessment of Roman foreign policy in late antiquity. When the political analyst Edward Luttwak published his book, The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, from the 1st century AD to the 3rd, most critics were skeptical. Indeed, the ancient literary sources do not discuss an imperial strategy at all, and every new administration under a new emperor seems to have pursued a separate agenda. But archaeological evidence from recent years seems to indicate a certain mutual understanding of the main issues of a strategic foreign policy, which included several scenarios for dealing with enemies and allies at the border of the empire in different ways. This issue will be touched again in this volume. Rubel on the settlement of Ibida on the lower Danube. In this general context, we hope that new archaeological data from the Eastern Barbaricum can support this rather new perspective, and that a lot of prestige goods can be identified or reassessed as diplomatic gifts and payment for services rather than commercial import or booty.